Thank you so much for being here. Come on in, sit down. The mystery of Walt Whitman continues to be with us. However, did this person, born 200 years ago, 1819, in May, humble origins, chaotic family, no particular education, no particular advantages, undistinguished work as a journalist, how did this person burst forth in 1855 with the greatest volume of poems that America has ever seen? Virtually every American poet after Whitman writes, I won't say in Whitman's shadow because he's not an inhibiting force, he's an inspiring force. All kinds of poets, black, white, Asian, Native American, they look in the direction of Walt Whitman and they say one simple thing: thank you, you got me going, right? Whitman encouraged poets to think that their spontaneous, free utterances could be of interest to others and indeed inspire others. How did he reach this point of writing this amazing volume? I really do not know. He discovered his soul, right, in his notebooks. He began to understand that the great poem of America had yet to be written. He learned from Ralph Waldo Emerson that even Emerson, the greatest literary figure of his age, was frustrated. And he was frustrated because he himself could not write the poem that America needed. As brilliant as Emerson was, he could not bring it to bear. So Walt Whitman, in 1854, a carpenter, a manual laborer, set to work in his notebooks, and the intimations for what would become the great American poet began to visit themselves upon him. He thought about God, he thought about the soul, he thought about compassion, and he thought about pride. And then, in time, he came out with this astonishing poem, which would eventually be called Song of Myself. We talked about it the last time we were together. What happens in the beginning of Song of Myself? Walt says, I celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Right? He's talking to you, the reader. He wants to invite you, not coerce you, invite you to participate if you want to in his vision, right? But he's also talking to his soul. He wants to conjoin the toughest, most worldly, most masculine part of himself with the part that is tender, humane, compassionate, responsive, artistic. And he does that in an astonishing scene. And that scene is a love scene. Come on in and sit down. It's okay. Walt would want you to come sit freely any place you wanted to. And if you're on the floor closer to the grass, it would be good. Right? So just make yourself comfortable. He says at the beginning of the poem, houses and rooms are full of perfume, that he loves the scent of perfume, he loves the old world books, the old culture, but he would prefer to take off his clothes, this is what Whitman likes to do, and go to the river banks and be undisguised and naked, right? And from there, having sloughed off convention and the great literary tradition that's behind him, Walt takes another step forward, right? He loafs, he invites his soul comes forward. There's a love scene between self and soul, you remember that, rather outrageous as it is, right? And then when he decides that he's able to conjoin self and soul, when he's able to conjoin self and soul, and he achieves a united sense of being, his imagination catches fire. Now, what happens when his imagination catches fire? He steps forward and he concocts the great American metaphor of the grass. What are we in this democracy? We are blades of grass that contribute to one great expanse of grass. We are individuals. Every grass blade is different from every other, but we are members of a group as well. Take a few steps back and we are united and we are one. Look at us individually and we are specific and idiosyncratic in our own ways. He hits on that metaphor of the grass and he keeps spinning. Every time Walt achieves something in the poem, he puts on new powers and he moves forward, able to take on new existential quandaries. So one of the things he's able to do after he discovers that metaphor of the grass is fly high above the nation and see everyday people doing their work. And he praises them for it because Walt loves everyday people and he loves everyday people at work. If you told Walt that he was extraordinary, original, a genius, he would be a little bit depressed. If you told Walt that he was average, everyday, common, he would hug you and kiss you because that's what he wanted to be. He wanted to represent everyday, common people in an everyday, common language, though the language is nonetheless fairly difficult. Last time we left Walt, he was giving us a panoramic in-flight view of all of our fellow Americans, all of our fellow citizens doing their work together. One of the things I said last time, and I think it has some resonance, is that Walt shows us that although we seem to be working alone in America, we are working beside our brothers and sisters all the time, and that we should participate through his imagination in that astonishing community, that collective American endeavor of everyday work. Whitman loves carpenters, he loves farmers, he loves the mother with the child in her arms, and he wants us to love them as well. He has room in his vision for people who are intellectual, for preachers and teachers, but he has to strain himself a little bit to include those particular people. What he loves most, what is commonest, cheapest, nearest, is dear to me, he says, right? So that's where we left ourselves last time. Now we step into the great work, the great poem that is Song of Myself, okay? And as I told you, I believe that that poem is an organized and relatively coherent piece of work where Walt deals with one extremely difficult issue after another and helps us understand how we could, by virtue of the transformation that the poem invites, live a thriving life in the democracy, okay? He deals with many, many issues, but tonight I'm going to focus on a few of them. I'm going to focus on God, I'm going to focus on violence, and I'm going to focus on death, okay? How does a truly, I'm going to focus on Jesus. I'll say a couple words about God. How does a truly democratic individual think about Jesus? How does a truly democratic individual think about death? And how does a truly democratic individual think about violence? There are many more of these thresholds that Walt Whitman crosses imaginatively. And if you ever are disposed to read the book, which if I'm ever disposed to finish it, you can buy at a store, you will see that there are many other places that Walt needs to resolve his issue. They're difficult issues. Sex is one of them. Mutual love is one of them. The history of religion is one of them. His relationship to God is one of them. And I'll be happy to talk about those in our question and answer series. But right now, I hope everybody's got a piece of the quotations to look on with, to look at. Everybody got one? Maybe pass one down to this group up front. If somebody's got one by herself or by himself, that would be great. Because this poetry really bears hearing. If you leave with one thing, it will be, if you left here and said, you know, I don't know what the hell the professor was talking about, but some of that poetry was really pretty good. I'm going to go get that, you know? Yeah, go get that. 1855, Leaves of Grass, simply an amazing piece of work. The first time I read it, I was just blown away by it. A human being did this. I mean, human beings do a lot of things that are not so great, but you know, sometimes they're offset by what humans achieve artistically, ethically, compassionately, and this is one of the great offsetters of all time. A human being who was a nobody did this. So, here we go. As he nears the midpoint of his great poem, Whitman chants a series of triumphal songs. And why shouldn't he? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the preeminent literary man of the day, had looked out into the world and asked for an American bard. He wanted one who could take in the national expanse. This is Emerson talking. Our log rolling, our stumps and their politics, our fisheries, our Negroes and Indians, our boasts and our repudiations, the wrath of rogues and the pusillanimity of honest men, the northern trade, the southern planting, the western clearing, Oregon and Texas are yet unsung. Whitman has begun to sing those things, and he has done more. He's brought forward a telling portrait of himself as an average, everyday American, an American self, and symbolically stripped it down, voided it of cultural accumulations. He's made contact with his soul, depicted it in all its sensitivity and charm. Then, outrageously enough, he's dramatized the carnal connection of self and soul. From there, the world of imagination has opened up to him. His vision has become intense and mobile. He sees with preternatural power, from the Spirit of God to the mossy scabs of the worm fence and heaped stones and elder and mullein and pokeweed. Then, perhaps his greatest triumph of imagination, he's hit on the metaphor of the grass, a figure that concentrates what's for him the right relation between individual and group. He's launched his tour through the democracy, looking down on men and women of all sorts, savoring their experience, hymning common life, pulling us together, guarding us from loneliness. Why shouldn't he crow a little bit? Walt has a long way to go still in filling out his vision for America and Americans, but he's already traveled well down the road. There's still a lot to contend with. Death, God, and Jesus, the whole history of religion, in fact, which he takes up in the poem, violence, sex, and weirdly enough, something I'll be talking to you tonight about, the sun. Strange as it may seem, you'll see it matters. How does the democratic individual and the democratic nation deal with religion, with evil and violence, with authority and with death? In this lecture, I intend to talk about those questions from Walt's vantage. But first, some celebration by Walt. Celebration of himself, you won't be surprised to know. Closing in on the middle of the poem, Walt looks back and records his triumphs. And this should be on your sheet. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. The pleasures of heaven are with me, and the pains of hell are with me. The first I graft and increase upon myself. The latter I translate into a new tongue. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. And I say there is nothing greater than the mother of men. I chant a new chant of dilation and pride. We have had ducking and deprecating about enough. I show that size is only development. Now, Walt is the poet of body and soul, and he shows us what the conjunction of the two reveals. He knows something new about pleasure and pain, and something that should have been understood forever about the role of women and the status of men. He chants a chant of confidence as well, confidence in this new nation, America. At the end of Whitman's hymn to physical life, he affirms his willingness to worship the sun. Sun so generous it shall be you. In the 1855 preface, he compares the sun to the compassionate poet's broad acceptance of one of the most beautiful lines he ever wrote. What I want to talk about here is this initially very peculiar enmity that Walt has to the sun. Everything Walt loves and wants to embrace. Everything. Even school teachers, even preachers, he does his best. But the sun, in certain moods, really irritates him. Why on earth would a poet who affirms everything be skeptical about the life-giving, beautiful sun? But he says at one point about the sun, he judges not, the great poet judges not as the judge judges, but as the sun falling around a helpless thing. Often throughout the poem, Whitman has an affectionate relation with the sun, but not always. In a poem that affirms almost everything in creation, there are a few images, a few figures that Walt regards ambivalently. There are school teachers, there are preachers, there are literary men, and there are the past promulgators of religious doctrine. Whitman doesn't hate any of these people. Walt is not a hater. Walt is not a hater, but he does regard them complexly. He doesn't feel the unalloyed affection for them that he feels for most other women and men. Whitman seems to love every aspect of the natural world without qualification. Every aspect but one. He sometimes, not always, finds the sun to be a vexing, even a distressing object. Few are the writers who launch a vendetta against old King Saul. Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick said he'd strike the sun if it insulted me. But the enmity doesn't seem terribly specific. He might as well have said that he'd strike heaven. But Walt Whitman is bothered by the sun. He casts an aspersion here and an aspersion there. At one point, he announces there are millions of suns left, suggesting that the sun is not unique and uniquely important. At another time, he speaks of the suns I see and the suns I cannot see, multiplying the sun again, so diminishing it just a little bit. But at the middle of the poem, he becomes serious about his opposition to the sun. It's there that the contention between Walt and the sun seems to become an issue of life or death. When Whitman describes the sunrise, he describes a struggle. I think this is on your sheets. Something I cannot see puts forward libidinous prongs. Seas of bright juice suffuse heaven. The earth by the sky stayed with, the daily close of their junction, the heaved challenge from the east that moment over my head, the mocking taunt, see then whether you shall be master. I'll read those last 3 lines again. The earth by the sky stayed with, the daily close of their junction, the heaved challenge from the east, that moment over my head, the mocking taunt, see then whether you shall be master. The sun is taunting Walt. Strange. The sun is rising in the east, and rather than greeting it as a friend or brother, Walt falls into competition with it. See then whether you shall be master. The poet fears being overpowered and dominated by the sun. Why? How could the brilliant, fructifying sun be an enemy to Walt? Clearly we are witnessing a power struggle. Mastery is at stake here, and accordingly all of Whitman's strong feelings, and you'll remember these if you were here on Monday night, about dominion and submission come into play. Remember, Whitman hates abasement in all forms. Dazzling and tremendous, he says. How quick the sunrise would kill me if I could not now and always send sunrise out of me. How quick the sunrise would kill me if I could not now and always send sunrise out of me. Whitman needs to send sunrise out of him so as not to perish literally or metaphorically from the presence of the early morning sun. Why does the sun bother Walt as much as it does? Why does the sun seem to present itself as a figure of opposition in the quest to create American democracy and give birth to men and women of a genuinely democratic, egalitarian temperament? I'll try to answer. Kings and pharaohs often find their emblems in the sun. The sun is the sign of unified imperial power. It is one, isolated and alone, and it is so magnificent that it often compels worship. Shakespeare's King Richard II compares himself directly to the sun. Prince Hal, soon to be Henry V, a more adept politician than Richard II, affirms his power to imitate the sun. The sun is isolated and potent. It seems to rule the universe. It's an emblem for absolutist patriarchal rule. I suspect that to Whitman, the sun is an image for royal power and for the feudalism he does not like. I would speculate, and I'm only speculating, that from Walt's vantage, the worship of the king, the sun, or the sun-like figure is always a temptation in a democracy. Democratic citizens sometimes fear chaos. The sight of equal people going about their business, pursuing their desires and their goals, can seem too turbulent and confusing for some of us. And in a society where there is no stable ruling class and few enduring structures of power, chaos is always a real possibility. You can solve that problem in a number of ways. You can reaffirm the personal bonds of the democracy. You can remind people, as Whitman liked to do, that they are involved in what is probably the greatest and most promising social venture of all time. For this venture to work, they're going to have to tolerate, affirm, and ultimately love each other. But you can also try to resolve the fear of social chaos or the threat of chaos in another way. And this has a bearing on our contemporary situation, and it won't take you long to detect it, is my prediction. You can turn in the direction of a potent figure of authority. You can confirm a king, a god-like man, and it is almost always a man, who gives laws, who affirms values, who is clear and precise and declarative. You can find a man who stands to the nation as the sun stands to the solar system. In the Republic, Plato describes how democracy becomes unmanageable. People cannot live on happily doing what they like. They will drown in private and public disorder. So along comes the savior who strides forward, affirms balance and propriety. What Plato does not understand, Whitman might say, is that in a true democracy, American democracy, people can achieve stability by making strong and flexible bonds with one another. We'll have the committed whole that we create collectively, so we won't need the totality that the sun represents, lording it over us. Faced by the sun, or sun-like figures, Whitman has an overt strategy. He proclaims that he's just as strong and fierce as the sun itself. He says, "We also ascend dazzling and tremendous as the sun. We found our own, my soul, in the cool and the calm of the daybreak. Walt ascends with all the force of a king or lord. He's a democratic man. How could he not? But there's an implicit strategy, and I found it more persuasive, of rebuttal to the sun. Think of the grass. Remember that you are one blade and that you can at times be lonely and confused. But you are more than that. You're part of the great green expanse. You belong. You're one of us here in the democracy. You don't need a sun king to help you feel at home on this earth. You don't need an overbearing God-man to create order for you. The order is there in the totality of the grass. The grass is the master metaphor in the poem that subtly opposes the metaphor of the sun. Faced with the threat or the promise of the sun, Whitman suggests an alternative. Think of the grass. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about another obstacle that Whitman has to deal with, and that's evil. Any number of people say that Walt Whitman has no conception of evil. And I used to think there was something in this, but I no longer do, and I'll try to tell you what he thinks evil is and why you should consider adopting this as a definition of evil from your own perspective. I understand the large hearts of heroes, says Walt. Song of Myself is in its way an epic, and like an epic poet, its author seeks to teach its readers what they need to know to live well. Homer taught his listeners how to pray, how to sacrifice, how to imagine the gods, and also, perhaps most importantly, what it means to be a martial hero. Anyone reading Walt's poem for the first time could be persuaded, as he or she passes the midpoint, that Walt would be a pacifist. He loves all life, and he loves all, or almost all, men and women in the world. Why would he want to see anyone harmed? Yet Whitman, strangely enough, on first encounter, does not deny martial heroism. He seems to see it as essential for the development of a new democracy. Our heroism cannot be Homeric. It goes without saying. Homer's heroism is all about the extraordinary individual. Hector, Achilles, Agamemnon, Diomedes. We in America need a version of bravery that fits the new way of life. I tell not of the fall of the Alamo, says Walt. No one escaped to tell the fall of Alamo. The 150 are dumb yet at Alamo. The Mexican-American war scene that Whitman does relate, the scene of what he calls a jet black sunrise, is of a massacre of American fighters. No one exists to tell the story of Alamo, at least no American. But I suspect that Whitman did not want to write about Alamo, and not only because it had been written about so often, even by 1855. Writing about the Alamo would almost inevitably have meant writing about heroes, the famous commanders whose stature is far above the 150 who died with them. He would have had to write about the colonels who commanded the fort, Colonel Travis, Colonel Bowie, and best known of all, Colonel Davy Crockett, one of the most storied figures in American pioneer history. I don't know if any of you are of an age to remember the great days of Davy Crockett, when any boy who was a boy had a Davy Crockett cap. I wanted one badly. My grandmother gave it to me, and do you remember that?
Girls too.
Girls too. Good for you. Yeah, that's the right direction to go. Yeah. I was so pleased when I got my coonskin cap made out of real plastic coonskin. I wanted to wear it to school and to church. My parents were always looking out for my social negotiability, and they said, no, man, don't be wearing that to school or to church. Just like romp around the house with your Davy Crockett hat. Yeah? Anyhow, that's what it was about. These are the sorts of men to whom people raise statues. And to Whitman, contemplating a cow crunching its food is more edifying than gazing at one of those. You can imagine, Whitman doesn't like statues. Whitman doesn't like statues, not a single bit. You know? When people are talking about statues now and all the controversies that are around them, I think about Whitman, who thinks that raising statues to any individual is turning that individual into a god, right? It's like Rome, it's like Greece. What would Whitman want to do with the statues? Knock them over. Knock them all over. Every last one of them. Knock them all over. Now, that may give you a sense of something you resist in Whitman, you know? Whitman is not that interested in heroes. He's interested in the people and what the people achieve individually and collectively. Right? So, and here you're going to get an instance. Whitman wants a fresh slate. Instead of writing about the Alamo, he writes about the massacre of 412 young men at Goliad in 1836. They were, Walt says, the glory of the race of Rangers. matchless with a horse, a rifle, a song, a supper, a courtship, large, turbulent, brave, handsome, generous, proud, and affectionate, bearded, sunburnt, dressed in the free costume of hunters, not a single one over 30 years of age. The Rangers have fought furiously against their enemies. They've killed twice their number before they run out of ammunition and treat for honorable surrender. Terms are given, but the enemy reneges and takes the Rangers out to slaughter. Whitman's heroes are not victors. They've lost the fight. It's in their death that their heroism lies. The scene of the massacre is brilliantly depicted. Walt is a very good storyteller for a lyric poet, and it is horrifying. Some of the Rangers made a mad dash. Some made a mad and helpless rush. Some stood stark and straight. A few fell at once, shot in the temple or heart. The living and the dead lay together. The maimed and the mangled dug in the dirt. The newcomers saw them there. Some half-killed attempted to crawl away. They were dispatched with bayonets, battered with the blunts of muskets. A youth not 17 years old seized his assassin till two more came to release him. The three were all torn and covered with the boy's blood. The Americans are not victors here, but victims of deception and cruelty. Here is no celebration of victory. There is no victory to celebrate. Whitman doesn't gesture ahead to the culmination of the Mexican-American War, which leads to the independence of Texas from Mexico and Spain, and eventually to becoming one of the states. Why did Whitman choose this brutal, potentially dispiriting event? He tells us before the tale of the slaughter begins. The Rangers have been brought out, and it's clear to them what's about to happen. They're told by their enemies to abase themselves, but they will not. Then one of the most important lines in the poem. None of them obeyed the command to kneel. None of them obeyed the command to kneel. They would not grovel before their captors. In the 1855 preface to the great volume, Whitman speaks of how Americans have the air of persons who never knew how it felt to stand in the presence of superiors. To Whitman, an American, or any democratic person, often when Walt says America, he means democracy, is quite simply someone who will never obey the command to kneel. We don't kneel to kings, and we don't kneel to dukes and barons, and we don't kneel to those who are richer and better placed than we are. We don't kneel to God or the saints or Holy Mother Church. As Whitman says in a passage on the animals and what they have to show us about our corrupted selves, not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. We don't kneel, period. There are those who say that Whitman lacks a sense of evil. He blesses almost all that surrounds him and finds everything that lives to be holy. In Varieties of Religious Experience, great book by William James, James calls him the proponent of the religion of healthy-mindedness. The particular faith does all it can, James says, to banish disagreeable thoughts from the minds of its adherents. James calls Whitman the supreme contemporary example of the inability to feel evil. There is no truth in such a view. Whitman does have a view of evil, simple and profound. Evil for Walt is based upon domination. When one person or group stands above another, the result is inevitably evil. When you are compelled to kneel, wrong is being done to you. When you compel others to kneel, you are perpetrating evil. When the chief sin in Whitman is abasement of others and of the self. When one stands above another, cruelty is the inevitable result. Almost every evil in life, Whitman suggests, lies in the wish to denigrate another. He declares it in most memorable terms. He who degrades another degrades me. The Mexicans who perpetrate the massacre are perpetrating evil. The slave catchers who in the poem drive a black man to the ground alongside the fence are doing evil. The men selling the mulatto girl that we talked about on Monday are doing evil. So too, when you abase yourself to another's power and offer no resistance, you are doing evil. One of Whitman's favorite life sayings was, obey little, resist much. Obey little, resist much. Those who kneel and induce their fellows to kneel to others of their kind who lived thousands of years ago are perpetrating a form of evil. In America, everybody stands. So it should be. Next obstacle, next crisis, next opportunity for Walt, Jesus. What is he going to make of religion? What is he going to make of Jesus in the comprehensively Christian nation? What place does religion have in democracy? When Whitman wrote, America was an overwhelmingly Christian nation, and Christianity does remain its predominant faith. Should the citizens of the new democracy continue to worship Jesus? Should they continue to go to this church or that? Perhaps democratic citizens should drop religion altogether. Maybe they should become atheists in the mode of Marxist egalitarians. As Song of Myself moves to its close, Whitman begins to take on what might be the most complex, demanding question before him, the religious question. He wants to explore belief and draw conclusions about what Americans of the future should believe. Being Whitman, he does not approach the religious question in a conventional way. Wanting to understand what role Jesus ought to have in the democracy, Whitman, flushed with the imaginative power he's accrued so far, you know what happens next. Flushed with the imaginative power he's accrued so far, he simply becomes Jesus, right? And he becomes Jesus in Jesus' most perilous hour, the hour of the crucifixion. And you should have this on your sheet. Somehow I have been stunned. Stand back. Give me a little time beyond my cuffed head and slumbers and dreams and gaping. I discover myself on the verge of the usual mistake, that I could forget the mockers and insults, that I could forget the trickling tears and the blows of the bludgeons and hammers, that I could look with a separate look on my own crucifixion and bloody crowning. To read those last few lines again. That I could forget the mockers and insults, that I could forget the trickling tears and the blows and the bludgeons of the hammers, that I could look with separate look on my own crucifixion and bloody crowning. I discover myself, says Whitman, on the verge of the usual mistake. What is this mistake? I would speculate that the mistake is believing that Jesus is anything other than a mortal man. If he were more, if he were God or the Son of God, Whitman could not manage to inhabit his body and share his experience. On some level, Jesus is no different from the dying fireman and the hounded slave that Whitman merged with in the passages leading up to this one. Jesus, too, is within Walt's compass. But after the death of Jesus, there comes the resurrection, or so the Gospels tell us. Walt might have canceled that part of the story and left us with his conjunction with Jesus at the crucifixion. But he doesn't. In Whitman's rendering, Jesus rises from the dead, but he does so not alone. I remember, says Walt, I resume the overstayed fraction. The grave of rock multiplies what has been confided to it, or to any graves. The corpses rise, the gashes heal, the fastenings roll away. The corpses, not the corpse, the corpses rise, the gashes heal, the fastenings roll away. This is a very unusual Easter Sunday morning, because it's plural, not just singular. Jesus rises from the dead, but so do all the other corpses, all made whole, gashes healed. We all emerge from the tomb with Jesus, but this rising isn't a prelude to ascent into heaven. Instead, it's the beginning of what Walt calls, in an absolutely unforgettable phrase, an average unending procession. An average unending procession. And here it is. I troop forth, says Walt, as Jesus and as himself at the same time, replenished with supreme power, one of an average unending procession. We walk the roads of Ohio and Massachusetts and Virginia and Wisconsin and New York and New Orleans and Texas and Montreal and San Francisco and Charleston and Savannah and Mexico, inland and by the seacoast and boundary lines, and we pass the boundary lines. Walt, as Jesus, American Jesus, emerges from the tomb that is the past to march forward into the future. Jesus is nothing terribly special, nor is Walt. Singly and merged together, they are simply part of the procession that tramps its way through these states. They have risen from the sleep of the past into the new world of democratic possibility and walk forward together into the future, traversing these states. Whitman has transformed the doctrine of Jesus' resurrection. It's not about the Savior's immortal powers. Rather, the resurrection is an image for the rebirth of humanity here in the United States of America. Jesus matters to Walt for many reasons, but Jesus matters to Walt because he's the first democratic individual. He preaches the equality of all men and women in the face of the cultures of the Romans and the Jews. The Jews lived under the authority of the rabbis, the Romans under the authority of the emperor. Both cultures were complexly structured and hierarchical. Jesus teaches equality for all. That which you do to the least of mine, says the Savior, you do unto me. This was an outrage to some of Jesus' contemporaries in the Jewish faith and virtually all Romans, among the most competitive and hierarchical people the world has ever met. The idea was, at least when first encountered, almost impossible to comprehend. The people that the Romans went to the Colosseum to see butchered weren't human beings at all, at least as they saw it. They didn't count. Almost no one who was not a Roman citizen was of consequence. Yet in time, the vision of Jesus overcame the values of Rome, and the seeds for democracy went into the ground. Who do men say I am? Says Jesus to his disciples in the Gospel of Mark. Whatever doubts Jesus may or may not have had about his identity, much of the world came in time to regard Jesus as the Son of God. So it was when Whitman wrote, so it is today. Whitman, though, writes to de-divinize Jesus. He dissociates Jesus from the Father and from organized religion. There's no mention of God in the crucifixion passage and no mention of heaven. Walt makes Jesus a breathing, suffering man, like me and you. Jesus, as conventionally understood, takes us toward democracy, but only part way. His engagement with God the Father, complex as it may be, still connects him to hierarchical faith, to the Father, to heroes, to feudalism, and to Whitman's spiritual nemesis, the Son. God the Father and the Son, cognate being. Whitman wants a son, S-O-N, who isn't a son, S-U-N. He wants a son as a brother and a buddy, right? So he disconnects Jesus from God and makes him one of the common people. In Saga Myself, Jesus is Walt, almost everybody is, and he's also, we might rather daringly say, the first American. Walt tries to do to Jesus and his legacy something like what Jesus did to the Hebrew Bible. Take it a step forward. Jesus shucks off what he sees as the oppressive laws of the Pharisees who had ruled for every aspect of life. He goes so far as to reduce the Ten Commandments to 2. Love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, and mind. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. Whitman comes along and reduces the issue further. Now there's only one commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. In this late phase of the poem, Whitman puts his religious vision into a set of stories about the development of culture. The only philosopher Whitman ever really cared about was Hegel, and particularly his vision of the way historical cultures phase, give way to one another. Says Walt in Democratic Vistas, we see that almost everything that has been written, sung or stated of old, with reference to humanity under the feudal and oriental institutes, religion and for other lands needs to be rewritten, resung, restated in terms consistent with the institution of these states and to come in range and obedient uniformity with them. Walt's prose is not always transparent, right? But what he's saying is that everything that has existed so far as culture has got to be reimagined and resung based upon the profound knowledge that human beings flourish best under democracy. Right? Whitman sees himself as the spirit of democracy, and he wants to show us how our new order of the world advances beyond other world orders, without obliterating them or violently turning against them. Jesus would never Walt would never turn against Jesus in any vituperative way. He would never turn against God in any vituperative way. He says that he believes in God, though his belief in God is not conventional, but it's nonetheless is strong. He is not, the amazing thing about Whitman is that, one of the many, he's not violent in his aversions. He wants to build upon affectionately what has come his way, but he also believes that he is initiating a new order of the world that the great American experiment has put him in a position to initiate. Now, Whitman and his resurrected fellows are on the march forward into the future. Our swift, you should have this on your sheet. Our swift ordinances, our orders, are on their way over the whole earth. The blossoms we wear in our hats are the growth of 2,000 years, the year since the birth of Jesus. Élèves, I salute you. Students, I salute you. I see the approach of your numberless gangs. I see you understand yourselves and me, and know that they who have eyes are divine, and the blind and lame are equally divine. And my steps drag behind yours, yet go before them, and are aware how I am with you no more than I am with everybody. And so what the vision is of all American Democrats, everybody who has a connection to democracy is on the open road, and they're walking with Walt, and they're walking with Jesus. And sometimes Walt is up front and Jesus is up front, but often they fade back into the pack, into the mix, and everybody just walks forward because Jesus effectively sowed the seeds of democracy. Walt picked those up and began to promulgate them to the people at large. Right? So that there's no turning against Jesus here. There is only affection, but a modification of the conventional sense of the Savior. The blossoms that Whitman and his élèves, his students, Where in their hearts are the growth of 2,000 years, roughly from the time that Jesus was born to Whitman's present? Walt and Jesus are the Elev's procession, sometimes up front, sometimes in the rear. Says Whitman in the 1855 preface, "The message of great poets to each man and women are, come to us on equal terms. Only then can you understand us. We are no better than you. What we enclose, you enclose. What we enjoy, you may enjoy. Do not suppose there could be only one supreme. We affirm that there can be unnumbered supremes." Walt is looking forward to the time when throngs will have read Leaves of Grass and begun to comprehend his revolutionary message. This is the last part, and it's the part about death, something that Walt has been putting off until the very end of the poem. Walt tells us that death does not concern him very much. "No array of terms can say how much I am at peace about God and about death," he says. Really? Are we to believe him? And as his students, his élèves, we might like to earn the same attitude. For how fine it would be to be at peace about dying. In fact, being at peace about death may be a prerequisite for getting all that Walt says there is to get about democracy. For what democracy would offer us is presence, unity, and individuality. Presence within the moment, unity with our fellow Democrats, and the chance to be ourselves day to day. The way into the average unending procession is through the achievement of presence and unity and singularity of self. Presence. That means not always being yoked to the past or achingly looking toward the future where death abides. Unity. That is the feeling of belonging in the world and not being an outcast. Even if you're an orphan, you'll never be outcast in a real democracy. You're also singular. Though your collective being matters most, you are you, and there never was and never will be another blade of the same shade green. The power that's in you is new in nature, says Emerson, and Walt would concur. If you can overcome the problem of death, you can look to achieve unity and presence and singularity of self. Whitman talks a lot about death, but his most important statement may come down to a line. It is simple. He is ending the poem and he is taking his leave of us, his readers, after performing his miracle. Emerson is right. It is the greatest piece of wit and wisdom America had so far produced, and we still have not yet fully absorbed its meanings. He's ending his poem and he's also reflecting on the ending of his life in the world. Here are his lines of farewell. I think these should be on your sheet. "I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the crass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You'll hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nonetheless and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love." We want to know how democratic people square themselves with death. Let's think first about how aristocratic people do it. To the Romans, who created the most aristocratic of cultures, there are a few ways to live beyond your span on earth. The first is by doing great deeds. Julius Caesar will live forever. So will Augustus. So Pompey the Great. Then, not as desirable, but not without value, one may live on through one's words. Public words may be best, oratory. Cicero will not die. But the works of the poets matter too. Virgil, Horace, Martial. One is ranked. The best of all soldiers and emperors live longest on the tongues of men. The best orators, the most quoted and admired poets do so. If you have neither martial deeds nor memorable words to recommend you, you can live on through your descendants. To the Romans, family is crucial. You are your clan. But to live on only because your name continues through time is a pale achievement compared to what eloquent speakers and conquering generals have done. Through deeds, through glowing words, through founding or supplying a distinguished line, you live into the future. As a Roman, your life has been agonistic. You struggled against other races, nations, empires for the glory of Rome. You struggled too against your own contemporaries. Who's the best soldier? The second? Whose words will ring out when Rome finally collapses into the Tiber? Competition is everywhere in the classical world, the precursor of the feudal world. Achievement gives you standing in this life and a measured immortality. And perhaps this takes some sting out of the serpent, death. But Walt Whitman, American, Democrat, has a different answer to the problem of death. At the end of his poem, Whitman wants to disappear, Or better, he wants to be reincarnated, not as president or mogul or chieftain, but as grass. Grass that we can look down and see beneath our shoes. And this is what we all should consider wanting. Not immortality through words or deeds of distinguished descendants, but ongoing life as grass blades. We're all going to die in the body and become compost. We're going to feed the earth. We're going to feed the grass. Unless you truly love nature, truly love it, that's not going to do much for you. But think of the figurative dimension. If you live as a blade of grass among other blades of grass, your passing into brown from vibrant green will feed the existing expanse of green. That expanse is democracy. If you have managed to live a democratic life, you'll have done something to contribute to the ongoing venture that is the free and equal state. And in that democratic nation, you'll be kept alive. You will achieve immortality because democracy does. In your daily life, you will be making a future for the greatest idea about how to live and govern and to love that humanity has ever had. Your contribution matters. It matters because democracy's success is not guaranteed. It may fade and it may die. After Athens and a few other Greek city-states, democracy disappeared from the world for what amounted to 2,000 years. There were intimations from the Vikings, maybe, intimations from the 7 nations, perhaps. But for about 2 millennia, there simply was nothing like full democracy. There was no real reason that it would be reborn again, but it was. There's no real reason that it would last, but maybe it will. Whitman understood what a gamble the whole enterprise was. He saw that the odds against were real. He realized, and taught us to realize, that if you do all you can for democracy, when you're about to die, you will be able to look back on the work you've put in and the laughter you've laughed in something like the same way that a composer looks back on her symphonies or a painter on his paintings. You'll see that you lived for something. Your life had meaning. Just so while you're alive, you may, just may, be able to worry about death a little less because you're contributing to something that will outlast you. Your life, your blade of grass, will go to fertilize and strengthen the lives of future generations of Americans who know enough to walk away from futile illusions, find self and soul, not be worried about being just one blade of grass, and maybe, most important to our current moment, watch out for the sun. What Walt seems to suggest is that if you immerse yourself fully in the democracy, become that grass blade, you will achieve a certain kind of immortality. The way of life that you have fully committed yourself to, democracy, will go on, even after you are departed. You've been part of something great, have contributed to something great. So maybe you can pass peacefully from the world, believing that great thing will continue. You're in a sense, but only in a very restricted sense, immortal. This is a lot to ask anyone to embrace. It's not easy to imagine losing one's fear of death because you can believe that the greatest human project of all time will go on after you. But perhaps one can imagine people evolving to the point where they might. Some think of Whitman as a poet of reassuring platitudes. He's actually a demanding poet, not only in what he asks of us as readers and interpreters, but in what he asks of us humanly. One wonders sometimes, could we ever become Walt Whitman's contemporaries? One wonders, could even Walt Whitman ever embody his vision outside the poem, bring it to life? At the end of the poem, we can now see Walt affirms the grass that he loves. In it, he wants to be reborn. This is the last great phase, the last great movement of the poem. I depart as air. I shake my locks at the runaway sun. I fuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. Walt affirms the grass, and he also declares victory in the greatest piece of trash-talking, subtle as it is, in the poem. I shake my locks at the runaway sun. He whipped it, right? The sun is running scared. The sun is running scared from Walt's song, and it should. He's rightfully pushed it aside, sent it back to nature. But the sun will be back. Walt knew that. The sun reasserts itself. But Walt is always there up ahead waiting for us. He'll be back too. The final line of the poem doesn't end with a period. It's open-ended, waiting for us to join in, maybe, and complete it for ourselves after our own fashion. I think that Whitman does exactly that for himself. And though he writes some splendid poems after 1855, the real completion of Song of Myself does not come through words, but through deeds. During the Civil War, as a hospital visitor in Washington, D.C., Walt Whitman brings his vision out into life for the salvation of himself and to inspire all who care to see. And that's what I'll be talking about on Friday night, how he fulfills the vision of the poem in his own active life. You ask yourself, could anybody be the person that Walt Whitman prophesies? I'll try to make the case that he does become that person. He does become that person. A firm pleasure. Still, at the close of the poem, he has left us with great bounties. A firm pleasure. Watch others and admire them in their work. Do so without abasement. Become those others when you can. Understand violence. Give Jesus his due, but no more. Give God his due, but no more. And last and most important, don't think it's small to be a mere blade of grass. You're a leaf surrounded by other leaves of grass in a massive, joyous humanity. There's nothing finer that you can be. Thank you for listening so well. That's a wonderful ovation, and I want to tell you that 80% of it was for Walt, and I'll take the 20 that's left over. What a person, you know? He's like us, human being. He did that. Whoa, yeah? You just got to stand out. Wow, that happened. That happened. So I'll be happy to take a few questions. I know, there are other things to do on Wednesday night aside from ask questions about Walt, but I could do it all night. But I understand that other people have other things in their life. So by all means, ask and be answered, if not enlightened.
Yes, thank you. Certainly Walt Whitman wrote a wonderful song to democracy, but he certainly must realize that democracy is evolving, right? Because it's imperfection, the march, the procession into the future. Presumably it's going to perfect itself. But how does he address that in the meantime, you're in the present, and injustice is all around? I'm particularly thinking about the American Indians, right? A lot of suffering. When I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I worked as an assistant photographer for the Lowy Museum of Anthropology. And I had to print out many, many pictures of Ishi, right, who was the last man the last person in his tribe. And there was a sadness in his face that's just sort of unbearable. So, I mean, yes, you could say, well, in the future it'll be better, but at the moment, Ishi is suffering. How does he address the fact that at the moment of presence, there are many injustices that takes place, that we just will wait and say, be patient, it will happen?
Well, I talk to political scientists, historians about democracy, and what they mostly want to talk about is structural changes, innovations, reform. Walt believes that democracy, true democracy, is based upon a change of heart. Okay? And that change of heart takes two very simple forms. One is comprehensive compassion and the understanding that we are all brothers and sisters and we are all in it together. Now, what that does for Indians on a reservation, I'm not sure, but I somehow am more fond of it as a step than I necessarily am about more legislation or more social action. That change of consciousness, which is what Walt's interested in, could lead to remarkable things. We still aren't there, for sure. That's why I'm talking about Walt. The other thing that he's interested in is, and this becomes psychological at a certain point, to never, ever kneel to anybody. We talked about that. But also to try to examine ourselves to see that we never take any pleasure at all. Or if we do, we question that pleasure in the abasement of other people. Right? So looking at people who are suffering can bring forth compassion, but I think it can sometimes also bring forward a kind of triumphal satisfaction. I have triumphed. I have dominated. and they have lost in the great realm, in the great game of life. I think what Walt encourages us to do is to examine our hearts for a competitive desire to be kings, be potentates, be knelt to, as well as to kneel. And I do think that if those spiritual achievements can be made, then the possibility of a better life for people who are suffering is going to become more real. I do think that all life is suffering and all life is hard, but there's needless suffering and there's humanly inflicted suffering that can be in many ways alleviated. And to me, Walt is one of the best keys. It's not going to work tomorrow, you know, but it's a spiritual doctrine, and I find it original and touching, and who knows, it may work, you know?
Hi, thanks for the lecture.
You're very welcome.
So you spoke on Walt Whitman seeing value in Jesus as a mortal man. Mm-hmm. You also talked about how it's a value to never kneel. So I was wondering what if there is a place for divinity or worship in Walt Whitman's democracy, or how he views it.
Yes, there is. And if you are if you're religious, you won't like it, I suspect, but you may respect it. Walt says that he believes in God. He sees signs of God everywhere. He sees signs of God in every human face, in every part of nature, and he adores God and he's grateful to God. But ultimately, he doubts whether God is any more grand than himself or anybody else in the democracy, right? He says that what you should worship really is the miracle of your own body, blood, and being. And also, you worship your other friends, colleagues, beloveds within the democracy, right? And yet his awe about the achievement of Jesus is very real, right? I mean, Whitman doesn't name many people in this poem that he has reverence for. And Jesus is clearly central to this vision, but the idea of Jesus as the Son of God is not one ultimately that Walt will accept. In terms of God as a figure who ushers you into heaven or doesn't, Walt says, I, who am curious about everything, am not curious about God. I got other stuff on my mind. You know, I think he's afraid that in most conventional visions, God becomes a son, okay? Central, demanding, judging, patriarchal figure. And once you've got one sun up in the sky, your tendency to respond to other suns on earth may be enhanced. You know? So you start looking for, I don't know, a chief executive who's a son, or a professor who's a son, or a father who functions as an SUN. Right? So Whitman wants us never, you know, Whitman never deconstructs anything fiercely. He just, why don't we just hold that question for a while, and let's see if we can get the democracy thing going, but all reverence to God, you know, for what he does for us. But let's not focus on him so much. Too much work, as your previous questioner said. We got too much work to do around here, and we got too much enjoyment to have, to be doing a whole lot of praying or obeisance to God at this point. But it's very, as I'll just emphasize one more, it's very like Walt. He may have his questions about conventional religion, but the idea of dismissing anybody's belief or turning cruelly anybody's cherished notions is completely foreign to him. He's a gentle poet and a gentle person. It takes a while to see what it is he wants to do culturally, spiritually, because it's so soft. It's so soft, you know? Yes?
Do you believe it's possible in this current political climate and social climate for Walt's dream of democracy to kind of come to full fruition?
I think it's very, the reason I wrote this book is because I think that we need to hear what Walt has to say, and that we have moved quite a distance away from that particular vision, okay? So what Walt is interested in is compassion among individuals. I find that more and more Americans address each other with what I could only call hate. Red America, blue America, there's a level of vituperation there that in my study of history such as it is, I don't think it's existed since the Civil War. You know, Walt reminds us that we are all brothers and sisters and that we should try to be. He says in one of his great moments in the preface, be patient with the people. You know, some of my learned colleagues should understand, be patient with the people, be patient. Right? So there's that. Okay, that's a big problem. lack of compassion, lack of mutual understanding. Second big problem is that we are plugged into feudalism in a way that would be very distressing for Walt. I'm not just talking about the resident of the White House, who is kingly in his self-presentation and kingly in his self-conception. I'm also talking about our interest in wealth and fame and celebrity, our desire to be celebrities, many celebrities ourselves. All of those things are part of a world, all those things are part of a world that is suddenly, resurgently feudalistic, and Walt would be very troubled by that. Walt's response to feudalism is not like the French Revolution, let's cut off the king's head. It's let's turn our back on the king, walk away and celebrate each other. You know? And when we celebrate each other and love each other and create the friendliness that's integral to democracy, the king will melt away. I don't know if you can believe that or not, but I think that's what Walt is saying, you know? It's like when Toto knocks over, you ever see The Wizard of Oz? Toto knocks over that stand, is pay no attention to the little man holding the controls, you know? They're all little men holding the controls when you have the wherewithal to say, as Dorothy does, I love my friends, they saved me, you can't do anything. You know, we're gonna do it together, it's a collective thing, right? So it's a bad time from Walt's point of view, but he's all the more necessary. You know, as I say, the sun will be back, probably for a long time, but Walt is there waiting for him. You know? Yeah, he's there waiting for him. We'll see what he can do.
I understand you have a certain level of admiration for Freud.
I do.
Based on your praise or seeming praise of Whitman's view of human nature, of being able to embrace each other and get past our differences, I imagine you reject Freud's pessimism about the kind of inevitable violence within the human nature.
Yeah. My view of Freud is that he's very good at describing us when we're in our most self-interested, self-absorbed, self-seeking mode. And we are most of the time, right? But then there are moments that I think everybody would agree that they have experienced in which they find themselves being more open, more generous, more kindly, more articulate, more feeling, more, let's just say, artistic than at other times. And Walt speaks to those times. Do you know what I mean? I mean, if you told Freud that there were times when people could be genuinely compassionate, genuinely kind, genuinely not ferociously oppositional to authority, but kind of benevolently indifferent to authority. Yeah, here comes the king again. I've had enough of him. Freud would just say that's not possible. That's not part of human nature. But again and again, we've seen people do that. You know, one of the best moments in American history seems to me when, all of George Washington's beloved young officers who surrounded him said, please, please, please be a king. And Washington said, President, hope they'll vote for me. Wow, what a moment. People do that some of the time. People do that. But it's a rising out of the self. Okay? Whitman describes the self in one way. The self is appetitive, strong, brawny, masculine. But it's not that far from Freud's conception of the ego, really. Competitive, large, brawling, that sort of thing. Contentious, agonistic. But when you combine self with soul in the right ratio, and Freud does not believe there's any kind of soul, and Freud has no conception. One of the things that's interesting about Freud is he's a genius. He has great things to say about everything. He has no idea where great art comes from. It just infuriates him. He cannot figure it out. He cannot figure it out, right? And to say that it comes from some generous, large part of the soul destroys Freud's whole system. So he just kind of stands in front of great art and stamps his feet. But, he's so illuminating on so many other things. Yeah, so I think Freud could have a lot to tell us about Walt's self, but about Walt's soul, he doesn't understand that. It's another dimension of our human experience that Freud is unable to comprehend. Great as he is. I mean, I stand in awe for some of his reflections, but that's where I have to part company with him. There's more to life than Freud thought. So I think. Here comes the microphone. One more and then we all go home? No more and then we all go home? All right. I hope to see you on Friday. When that happens, we'll talk about Walt's experience in the Civil War, what he did in the hospitals. We'll tell some stories, and we'll have a good time. Thanks for being here.